The inventory listed 17 rooms, 4 outbuildings, a working mill, and 1 dependent. Vivian Holt read that last line 3 times before the solicitor cleared his throat and asked if she had any questions. She had approximately 40 of them, none of which she intended to ask. The dependent, Mr. Carver explained, was a young woman who had been living at Thornfield Hall for some years. She had nowhere else to go. The previous Earl, God rest his soul, had made no formal provision for her in the will, which, he added delicately, was rather the whole problem with the estate. The new Earl, Frederick Weston, purchased Thornfield Hall on a Tuesday in October, sight unseen, for reasons his solicitor understood to be primarily financial and his mother understood to be primarily insane. He arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor Vale had been at Thornfield Hall since she was 19 years old. She knew which floorboard creaked outside the library. She knew that the east wing chimney smoked when the wind came from the north, and that Mrs. Parrish, the housekeeper, took her tea with exactly half a sugar and would refuse to speak to anyone before it arrived. She knew that the roses along the south wall had been planted by a woman named Catherine, and that Catherine had died before they ever bloomed. What Eleanor did not know, until 3 weeks before the new Earl arrived, was that Catherine had been her mother. She had found the letter in the back of a desk drawer, tucked inside a copy of a household ledger from 1834. It was written in her father's hand. She recognized it from the notes in the margins of his books, which she had been reading since she was old enough to reach the shelves. The handwriting was steadier than she expected for a dying man. Perhaps he had written it earlier. Perhaps he had been hoping for more time. "My dear Eleanor," it began, "there are things I should have told you when you were small enough to believe they didn't matter. I am sorry that I did not. I am sorrier still that I am telling you now, when there is nothing I can do to make them right." She had read the rest of it standing at the desk, not sitting, because somehow sitting had felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. Her father, Robert Vale, the 3rd Earl of Thornfield, had married Catherine Ashby in the spring of 1841. The marriage had not been approved by his family. Catherine was the daughter of a country vicar, gentle and educated but without money or title, and the Vale family had made their disapproval so complete and so sustained that Robert had eventually done what men in his position were not supposed to do. He had chosen his wife over his family and spent the following years in a kind of quiet exile at the estate he loved, raising the daughter they had together and trying not to think too hard about what would happen when he died. What would happen when he died, as it turned out, was this. The estate would pass by entail to his nearest male relative, a second cousin named Gerald who had visited Thornfield exactly once, eaten the good cheese, criticized the portraits, and never come back. The entail could not be broken. Eleanor could not inherit. Catherine was already gone, taken by a fever when Eleanor was 14, and Robert had spent the 6 years since quietly trying to find some legal mechanism that would keep his daughter safe. He had not found one. What he had done in those last months before his own illness took him was write the letter. He had set down, in careful detail, who Eleanor was and what she was owed, even if the law provided no instrument for her to collect it. He had written that the portrait in the east parlor, the one Gerald had tried to have removed and that Mrs. Parrish had quietly rehung twice, was of Catherine. He had written that Eleanor had her mother's eyes and her own considerable stubbornness, and that he was proud of her, and that he was sorry. He had left the letter in the ledger. Gerald had sold the estate 4 months later without setting foot on it, to a man named Frederick Weston, and had apparently not thought to mention Eleanor at all. She had considered leaving. She had, in fact, packed a bag twice. The first time, she got as far as the end of the drive before Mrs. Parrish appeared at the gate with an expression that communicated, without words, that this was not how things were done. The second time, Eleanor had sat on the edge of her bed with the bag at her feet and thought about where she would go, and the list had been so short and so bleak that she had unpacked it again. She had no money. Her father's accounts had been settled by Gerald's solicitors, which meant that everything liquid had gone toward the debts the estate carried, and everything else had been folded into the sale. Eleanor had the clothes in her wardrobe, a small collection of books, her mother's garnet earrings, and approximately 6 months of goodwill from Mrs. Parrish, before the new household arrangements made her position impossible, so she stayed. And when it became clear that Mr. Carver's communication to the new Earl had described her only as a dependent of some years' standing, she made a decision that she would examine more critically later. She did not correct it. When the new Earl arrived on that Thursday in October, Eleanor was in the kitchen helping cook sort through the preserves, wearing an apron that had seen better decades, with her hair pinned up in a way that suggested function rather than fashion. The new Earl walked in looking for Mrs. Parrish and found Eleanor instead. He was taller than she had expected. She realized she had been constructing some image of him in her mind, probably based on Gerald, and she let it dissolve now. Frederick Weston had dark eyes and an expression she couldn't immediately read, somewhere between purposeful and tired, and he looked at the kitchen, then at cook, then at Eleanor, and said, "I'm looking for the housekeeper." "She's in the linen room," Eleanor said. "Third door on the left past the servant's stair." He nodded, then he paused. "And you are?" Eleanor set down the jar she was holding. "Nell," she said, which was not a lie, precisely. It was what her father had called her. "I help with the household." He accepted this and left to find Mrs. Parrish. Eleanor exhaled. Cook said nothing, but her expression suggested she had opinions she was keeping professionally to herself. The first week was an exercise in managed invisibility. Eleanor had spent years moving through Thornfield the way people who belong to a place do, without thinking about it, without narrating it to herself. Now she found herself calculating which rooms the new Earl was likely to use, which hours he spent in the study versus the library, whether he was the kind of man who paid attention to the people around him or the kind who didn't. He was, she discovered, the kind who did. On Tuesday of the first week, he stopped her in the corridor outside the east parlor and asked if she knew anything about the portrait. Eleanor turned to look at it, as though she were seeing it for the first time. Catherine Vale, painted in 1840, in a blue dress, with dark eyes and a particular quality of stillness that the painter had caught better than he probably knew. "She was the previous Earl's wife," Eleanor said. "She died some years ago." The new Earl looked at the portrait for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. She kept her expression neutral with the kind of effort that didn't show, because she had been practicing it since she was 14 years old. "She has your eyes," he said. "A coincidence," Eleanor said. "Will there be anything else, my lord?" He let her go, but she felt him watching as she walked down the corridor, and she did not look back. His mother arrived on a Saturday. Lady Weston was a woman who had spent 50 years being right about everything, and intended to spend the next 50 the same way. She arrived with 2 trunks, a personal maid, and a comprehensive assessment of Thornfield's shortcomings that she began delivering approximately 12 minutes after stepping through the door. The entrance hall was drafty. The carpet in the east wing was original to the 1820s and looked it. The housekeeper seemed competent enough, but the kitchen girl— and here Lady Weston paused, looking at Eleanor with the particular focus of a woman who notices things— seemed rather too well spoken for her position. "She's been with the household some time, Mrs. Parrish said, and her voice carried exactly the right amount of finality. Lady Weston moved on. Eleanor moved through the rest of that day with her chin slightly lower than usual, which she recognized as a kind of self-preservation and didn't love about herself, but chose not to examine too closely. That evening, She found herself in the library after dinner, when she had calculated everyone would be in the drawing room. She had come for a specific book, a collection of letters from the Tudor period that her father had annotated in the margins and that she returned to sometimes when she needed to feel close to him. She was reaching for it when the door opened and the new Earl came in. They looked at each other. "I didn't realize anyone was in here," he said. "I was just getting a book," Eleanor said. "I'll leave. You don't have to." He moved toward the fire which had been banked for the evening. "What are you reading?" She hesitated. "Letters, historical correspondence, from the Tudor period." He raised an eyebrow. "Which collection?" she told him. He crossed to the shelf and looked at the spine, then pulled it out, flipped to the first page, and went still for a moment. "These are annotated," he said. "Yes, in the same hand throughout." He turned another page. "Someone knew these letters very well." "The previous Earl," she said. He read widely. Frederick Weston closed the book slowly and looked at her. "You knew him," he said. "It was not a question." "I was part of the household," Eleanor said. "That's not what I asked." The fire shifted. Outside, the wind came from the north, and the east wing chimney would be smoking, and somewhere in the house his mother was probably deciding what else needed to be replaced. "Yes," Eleanor said finally. "I knew him." He handed her the book. His fingers were close to hers for a moment, and she looked at the book instead of at him. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Nell." She walked out of the library and stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the wall and her father's book in her hands, and she thought, "This cannot go on." It went on for another 3 weeks. In that time, she learned that Frederick Weston had purchased Thornfield because it was a sound investment in agricultural land, and he had needed somewhere outside of London after his previous 2 years had been. She pieced this together from conversations she was not quite part of, difficult in ways he didn't explain. She learned that he read in the mornings and rode in the afternoons and had a habit of arriving in whatever room she happened to be in slightly before she expected him. She learned that he was not unkind, and that unkindness would have been easier to manage. She also learned, at the end of the 3rd week, that Gerald's solicitors had located a second cousin of her father who apparently believed he had some claim on the estate, and who had written to Frederick Weston's solicitor to discuss it. Mrs. Parrish told her this. Mrs. Parrish had the information because Mrs. Parrish had been at Thornfield for 31 years and had developed, over the course of that tenure, a system for knowing things that her employers would have found alarming if they had understood it. "His name is Whitmore," Mrs. Parrish said. "He's coming Thursday to make his case in person." Eleanor sat down. "He can't make a case. The estate was sold legally. He seems to believe there are grounds, something to do with the entail and whether it was properly dissolved before the sale." Mrs. Parrish looked at her with the steady gaze of someone who had been keeping this particular secret for 6 months and was tired. "Eleanor, you understand what will happen if he raises enough questions." She understood. If Whitmore forced a legal challenge, the provenance of the sale would be examined. And if the sale was examined, people would start asking questions about the household and about who exactly was still living in it, and why, and under what identity. She had 3 days. She found the letter that night and held it for a long time before she decided what to do with it. The thing about having evidence of who you were when who you were could not legally protect you was that it was not the same as having power. It was only the same as having truth. And truth, she had learned, required someone to act on it before it changed anything. She knocked on the study door at 8:30 when she knew he would be going over the estate accounts. He looked up when she entered, then set down his pen. "Nell," he said, and then stopped because something in her face must have changed. "What's wrong?" She closed the door behind her. She crossed the room to his desk. She put the letter down in front of him. "My name," she said, "is Eleanor Vale. My father was Robert Vale, the third Earl of Thornfield." He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He did not speak immediately, which she had not expected, and which, in retrospect, she thought she should have. Then he picked up the letter and read it. She stood and waited. The clock on the mantel ticked. The fire in the study burned steadily because the study chimney drew properly and always had. When he finished, he set the letter down very carefully. "You've been here the whole time," he said. "Yes, as a kitchen maid. I was never formally a kitchen maid. I needed somewhere to be, and I didn't know if you'd let me stay if you knew." He was quiet for a moment. "Why wouldn't I let you stay?" "Because it's complicated," she said. "Because Whitmore is Thursday with questions about the sale. And if you know who I am, it becomes your problem too. Because I couldn't ask you to take that on when you didn't know what you were buying." He looked at her. "Your father wrote this letter knowing you'd find it eventually. He ran out of options," she said. "He was trying to give me something, even if it wasn't land or money, even if it was just proof of who you are, of who I am." Frederick Weston stood up from his chair. He walked to the window, which looked out over the south garden where, she happened to know, her mother's roses were still blooming 3 weeks past when they should have finished for the year. He stood there for a long moment with his back to her. "When Whitmore arrives on Thursday," he said, "I will be meeting with him, and I will need someone present who knows the full history of this estate and this family." "Yes," Eleanor said, "I'd like that to be you." He turned around. "Not as a kitchen maid." She met his eyes. "As what, then?" "As Eleanor Vale," he said, "who has every right to be here." Whitmore arrived with a solicitor and a carefully arranged expression of concern. He was a thin man in his late 50s who had clearly spent the journey up from London, composing reasonable-sounding arguments for an unreasonable position. He was not prepared for Eleanor. She sat in the drawing-room in a dress that Mrs. Parrish had, without any discussion, simply produced from a trunk Eleanor had never thought to look through, and which fit her as though it had been made for her, because it had, her mother's, altered at some point in the 1840s for a woman of her exact proportions. She wore her mother's garnet earrings. She sat straight because she had been raised by a man who had told her that the way you sat in a room was a statement, and she had believed him. Frederick Weston sat beside her. Whitmore's solicitor began speaking about the entail. Frederick's solicitor responded. Eleanor listened. And when the question turned to the household history and the question of previous occupants, she spoke clearly and precisely about the estate's management under her father, the timeline of events before his death, and the letter which Frederick had had his solicitor examine and had determined to be exactly what it appeared to be. Whitmore looked at her with an expression she recognized, the recalculation of a man who had expected an obstacle and found a wall. His solicitor said they would need time to review. Frederick said that was fine. He said they were welcome to review whatever they needed, and that he looked forward to their conclusions. After they left, the drawing room was very quiet. "You did that well," Frederick said. "I've been watching my father manage difficult men since I was 8 years old," Eleanor said. "I had a good education." He laughed. A real one, not the polished version she had been hearing for the past 3 weeks. She found that she had wanted to hear that laugh without quite knowing she was waiting for it. Whitmore's claim dissolved over the following month, not dramatically but thoroughly. The way bad arguments tend to dissolve under examination, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to. It was, Eleanor thought later, not the ending her father had imagined when he wrote the letter. He had been hoping for something cleaner, some legal mechanism that would restore what had been taken. But the law had been what it was, and Gerald had done what he had done, and the estate had been sold, and there was no going back to a version of events where she had simply inherited Thornfield, and everything proceeded from there. What had happened instead was something her father's letter hadn't planned for, because it depended on a man her father hadn't known. Frederick Weston asked her to marry him on a Sunday morning in November in the South Garden in front of her mother's roses, which had finally given in and gone dormant for the winter but would, she knew, come back in the spring exactly as they always had. She said yes. Mrs. Parrish, who had been watching from the kitchen window, went directly to cook and said that she had been waiting 6 months for that, and that she would like her tea now, and that some days things worked out in ways that made the waiting worth it. The portrait in the east parlor stayed exactly where it was. Eleanor had always known it would. What changed was that she stopped walking past it without stopping. She stood in front of it now, sometimes in the mornings, before the house was fully awake, and she looked at her mother's steady eyes, and the blue dress, and the particular stillness that the painter had caught, and she thought about the letter, and the ledger it had been tucked inside, and the roses along the south wall, and the 6 months she had spent being invisible in the home she had grown up in. She thought about her father, who had run out of options and given her proof instead, and how proof, it turned out, had been enough. Not because the law had changed, but because the right person had read it. She thought about how things that are taken from you don't always come back in the form you expected. Sometimes they came back as something else, something harder to name but no less real. Frederick found her there one morning, standing in front of the portrait with her hands folded in front of her, and the early light coming in through the east window. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. "She has your eyes," he said, and this time it was not a question. "Yes," Eleanor said, "she does." He took her hand, and they stood there together in front of the painting, in the house that had once belonged to her father, and now belonged to them both. And outside the south garden was waiting for spring, and the roses would come back, and the east wing chimney would smoke when the wind came from the north, and Mrs. Parrish would take her tea with exactly half a sugar, and all of it, every last part of it, was home.